Let's talk about some of the early evidence in favor of the idea that language can exert a strong influence on human thought. In fact, much of it from Benjamin Lee Whorf. Now, the first example you're probably familiar with, and the question is, how many words are there for snow in Eskimo? And you might have heard that perhaps there are several hundreds, and the mythology of this has grew over time. But certainly, Eskimo is said to have, Eskimo languages are said to have several different words, perhaps up to 100 or hundreds, to refer to snow. In fact, here's Benjamin Lee Whorf. We, as in speakers of English, have the same word for falling snow, snow on the ground, snow packed hard like ice, slushy snow, wind-driven flying snow, whatever the situation may be. To an Eskimo, this all-inclusive word would be almost unthinkable. He would say that falling snow, slushy snow, and so on are sensuously and operationally different. They are different things to contend with. He uses different words for them and for other kinds of snow. See, the idea behind this, the intuition, is that an Eskimo, because an Eskimo has many different words at his or her disposal to refer to snow, they can conceptualize snow in many different ways. To us, as speakers of English, snow is just one thing, kind of a white thing that falls from the sky, but sort of we don't have categories provided to us from our language to really express the difference in, how hard-packed snow or slushy and soft snow might actually be very different things to interact with. Eskimo languages, on the other hand, do have several different words to refer to snow, and each different word allows you to conceptualize the snow in a slightly different way. One stresses the fact that this kind of snow is really light and you can't do much with it. Another one might stress the fact and might allow you to categorize some types of snow as hard and sturdy and maybe good for building something or a structure. Sort of this is the intuition behind it. The fact that the presence of so many words for snow allows a speaker of an Eskimo language to think differently or to have all this nuanced way of thinking about snow. Here's a second example, again from Benjamin Lee Whorf. Now, in 1939, Whorf published a study, an observational study of the Hopi people of northeastern Arizona. And he noticed that in their language, they had no clear grammatical distinctions for future and past, the same way that, for example, a European language might have. And he also noticed that they didn't really have a means provided by language to count specific lengths of time, like an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And so he reasoned that the absence of these markers would have made a speaker of Hopi less inclined of conceptualizing chronology in that sort of exact way that speakers of a European language, for example, might. And he even thought that they might be less able to recall past or predict the future because of a lack in their language of a means to refer to past and future. In fact, here's his own words. Hopi might be called a timeless language. It does not distinguish, and this I inserted with grammatical structures, it does not distinguish between the present, the past, and the future of an event itself. So again, the idea is that because there's no clear grammatical marking, there's no clear conjugation or something of that sort, the same way that there is in European languages, then this might imply that rather the Hopi language doesn't provide to speaker of Hopi the same infrastructure to think about language. So his conclusion was that a speaker of Hopi would think about time, in a different way than how a speaker of some European language that has grammatical markings for time would think about time. Now, there are, however, a number of very important problems with this initial evidence. The first is really a big fallacy upon which this evidence is built. The idea that because a grammar doesn't allow you to distinguish between two objects or to mark time or something like that, A, doesn't mean that you cannot draw that distinction in some other way. And B, it doesn't mean that because your language doesn't allow you to have a word for, one type of snow or for a different type of snow, doesn't mean that to you those two types of snow seem the same. Just because English, let's say, doesn't distinguish between light powdery snow and very tightly packed snow, doesn't mean that I would treat them in the same way. And similarly, just because a language like Hopi might not have a conjugation like a European language does not mean that there aren't many other ways in which time could be indexed. And I will give you examples of both of these things in just a moment. Second, a very deep criticism of this is the idea that, is it the case that your language truly is a lens on your thought? Does language truly reveal your thought? So if you don't have something in your language, if you can't use it, does that really mean that you can't understand it? Let me give you this example. So a friend of mine, a speaker of Russian, once told me that Russian has a specific word to talk about a light that originates from the reflection of a shiny surface. So imagine you being in a room, the sun shines in, and your watch sort of has a shiny surface, and so it kind of bounces a light on a wall, or you might have had that experience with your phone, maybe sort of shining, reflecting a light on the wall. Now, my understanding, and if you're a speaker of Russian, email me that word. My understanding is that Russian has a specific word to refer to that kind of reflected light. Now, Italian, which is my sort of first language, doesn't have that. I really don't think English has that. And even in my other primary language, which is French, I don't think we have a specific word to refer to that. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't perfectly understand what is being meant by that concept. Just because my language doesn't have or doesn't embed in its vocabulary a certain concept, it really doesn't mean that I can't understand it. So in this sense, it's not the case that language reveals how I think. Now, back to the two examples of Benjamin Lee Whorf. The first is the Eskimo languages having several hundreds of words for snow. So first, it's actually not true that it has several hundreds. But what is more important is that English actually also has lots of terms for snow. And here's a few. Snow, sleet, slush, blizzard, avalanche, hail, hardpack, powder, flurry, dusting, etc., etc., etc. So, in fact, also English has a lot of different words for snow. So, sort of that introspection by Benjamin Lee Whorf that somehow speakers of some Eskimo language, perhaps Inuit, of course they have so many words for snow because they have to think of snow in all its nuances because they live in an environment that is plentiful in snow. Really doesn't hold much water. And you can make a very similar example for the idea of Hopi being a timeless language. True, Hopi does not have grammatical markers for time, as do other languages such as English, Italian, French, etc. But they do express language. They do express time in many other ways. Hopi it contains tense. It contains metaphors for times. It contains unit of time, like the days, numbers of days, or parts of the day. It does contain ways to refer to units of time, also like something being ancient or quick or long or finished. And in fact, here's an excerpt from a Hopi text, which says, "Then indeed, the following day, quite early in the morning, at the hour when people pray to the sun, around that time, he woke up the girl again." Now, I don't know you, but this seems to me someone who understands perfectly well the chronology of time. So again, just because Hopi doesn't mark time the way other languages do, or doesn't have an as clear marker of time, doesn't entail anything about the ability of the Hopi language to express time in other ways, and thereby it doesn't entail anything about the ability of a speaker of Hopi to conceptualize time however his or her language allows them to do. Now, finally, last couple but important criticisms to this initial type of evidence. First, the translations used by Worf were very simplistic. He did use a very simple sort of word-by-word translations, and these never quite captured the richness of a certain language. I mean, just take one example. There's an expression in English, if it rains a lot, to say it's raining cats and dogs today. If I were to say that and translate that literally to Italian, people would think I'm crazy. So in the sense that the type of simple word-by-word translation that Worf used didn't quite do a good job at capturing the intended language. Perhaps one of the worst criticisms of Benjamin Lee Worf's initial evidence, and this is where the more modern, the more recent evidence that we will look at departs from this, is the idea that there was really embedded a great circularity in this whole argument. Because essentially the argument goes, look, there are all these differences in language. Well, Hopi is like this, whereas English is like that. It has to mean that speakers of English and speakers of Hopi think very differently. But then what's the evidence? What's the separate, independent evidence that speakers of English and speakers of Hopi think differently? Well, look at their language. They're so different. Of course they must be thinking differently, right? That's the idea. It's completely circular. There are differences in language. What's the evidence? The differences in language imply that there are differences in thought, but how do you know that there are differences in thought? Well, look at the differences in language, right? It's completely circular. There's no independent study of thought independent of language. And that is where the modern study of the relationship between language and thought, typically, that's the level at which things are typically looked at. So you look at some language, and then you separately look at some aspect of thought independent of language, and then you see if there's a relationship between the type of language that somebody speaks and the way in which they think. But more about this a little further now. And finally, one other very important criticism, and this is always still relevant in today's work, it's difficult to fully disentangle the effect of culture on differences, on cross-linguistic differences. Sure, people who speak different languages might have differences, but are those because of the language, or are those just because of cultural artifacts? Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the biggest limitations of the early evidence is its circularity, in that it never looked at thought independent of language to try to establish whether speakers of different language do behave and think differently. And this is where the study by Caroline Casagrande, a classic study, actually marks a different type of study in order to try to assess the relationship between language and thought, and really marks the beginning of these parallel studies where we take speakers of different languages and we independently evaluate their thinking, and we see if it differs in a systematic way that matches the differences in language. And this is just a great first example. Now, Caroline Casagrande leveraged the fact that the Navajo language expresses in its verb endings the shape of an object. So this means that when you're speaking, when you're using a verb which concerns an object, as part of the verb, you need to encode what is the shape of the object. So the theory goes that if this is the case, you'd imagine that a speaker of Navajo, to them, the shape of something is a particularly salient thing. It's just something they would spontaneously pay more attention to, because every time they speak a verb, they need to encode in it what's the shape of the object. So that's just something that you have to pay attention to so that you can use properly your verbs. In English, we don't have such a construct. So in the sense, in English, the shape of something is not salient in the same way. Our language doesn't make the shape of something salient in the same way that the Navajo language does render salient. And so you can appreciate how this is really a case of, does the structure of a language affect the way in which people think? So here's what they did. They took three groups of children, and one group were Navajo monolinguals, one group were speakers of Navajo that also spoke English, and the third group were speakers of English monolinguals. And the task went as follows. They were presented with an object, for example, a blue rope, and then they were shown two additional objects. In this case, a yellow rope and a blue stick. Now, the task was simply to decide whether the blue rope belonged with the yellow rope or with the blue stick. And see, the intuition is that if indeed being a speaker of Navajo makes shape a particularly important aspect of an object, because your language requires you to pay attention to it, then you'd imagine that speakers of Navajo would more spontaneously sort the blue rope with the yellow rope, as opposed to with the blue stick. And indeed, when you look at speakers, at monolingual speakers of Navajo, they tend to sort 70% to 30% the blue rope together with the yellow rope. So in this sense, this finding certainly bears out the idea that to a speaker of Navajo, the shape of an object is a salient feature. Now, how about children who were bilinguals and spoke both Navajo and English? Well, in their case, the finding was reversed, although not too far away from split. And so some children just sorted the blue rope with the blue stick. Other children sorted, a minority, sorted the blue rope with the yellow rope, exactly as you'd expect. In this sense, it really shows that if you only speak Navajo, your language really forces you to pay attention to the shape of something, and so that becomes an important criterion. It becomes an important feature, excuse me. If instead you're both a speaker of Navajo and English, then who knows? It depends maybe. It depends maybe on your habits. However, they then also tested English monolingual speakers. In fact, these were children in Boston. And it turns out that the children, the English monolingual children, actually sorted exactly like the Navajo only, the monolingual speakers of Navajo. So in the sense, this experiment is a landmark because it really marks a different way of proceeding in the study of language and thought. It marks a new type of experiment where we don't just look at language to infer thought, but we try to draw correlations between the features of one's language and how one thinks. Unfortunately, of course, the finding that English monolingual speakers sort exactly like Navajo speakers, like Navajo monolingual speakers, unfortunately goes against what would be hypothesized under the constitutive view of language. But still, this experiment is definitely a wonderful illustration of how you can study the relationship between language and thought.